Welcome to my lecture series on Middle East politics. This is lecture 24. In today's lecture, we're going to be discussing electoral authoritarianism in the region. Now, to get started, I'm going to share my screen with you. So let's get to it. All right, here we go. All right, so authoritarianism in the Middle East. Well, when I first traveled to the region and visited and later lived in Tunisia for about 7 years, I kind of at first thought that authoritarianism would be a lot like a totalitarian dictatorship, like you kind of see in North Korea today, or what was once seen in fascist Germany under the Nazis or under communism, right, with Stalin and the Soviet Union. So I had these ideas in my head that under an authoritarian regime, there would be absolutely no freedom, that there would be goose-stepping soldiers in the streets, that there would be spies everywhere, that there'd be no opposition to the regime. But here's the thing. This is not actually how authoritarian regimes work. That's how totalitarian regimes work, okay? But authoritarian regimes are very different. And so we're going to understand in today's lecture what electoral authoritarianism is. It's a very different type of dictatorship. We're also going to understand why it is that so many of the Arab republics of the region, such as Egypt, Tunisia, later countries like Algeria, shifted to electoral authoritarianism from the 1970s to the 2000s. So, in fact, you see this shift in a lot of dictatorships across the world where they moved from these single party totalitarian regimes to more electoral authoritarian style forms of dictatorship. And finally, we're going to understand why these types of dictatorships had a lot of staying power, why they stuck around for so long. In fact, some of them are still sticking around. So we're going to try to understand why it is that these regimes have some surprising durability. So first, what exactly is electoral authoritarianism? Well, let's look at one of those terms in this concept, authoritarianism. Now, the best way to think of authoritarianism is first off, it is a dictatorship. Okay, so just like a totalitarian regime, you have a small group of elites within the state, right, within the government that are dominating the political system. And of course, within this system, there's no real competition for power. However, unlike a totalitarian system, unlike the single party dictatorships we discussed in an earlier part of the semester, so if you go to a previous lecture, you could learn about those type of regimes. So unlike those regimes, electoral authoritarian regimes do not try to dominate all of society. They don't try to mass indoctrinate the masses. They don't try to eliminate all of the opposition. And in fact, they allow at least some opposition to exist. Now, this opposition might come in the form of opposition political parties that will actually run candidates for office. It might come in the form of opposition non-governmental organizations and interest groups that exist outside the state and labor unions. So they might be able to exist. However, the opposition can never actually win elections or come into power. So with authoritarian regimes, an opposition is allowed, but there is no real competition for power. Okay. And some types of authoritarian regimes, okay, in fact, the vast majority in today's world also have electoral systems with multiple parties. We call these electoral authoritarian regimes. Now, like single party states that we talked about earlier in the semester, they hold elections, but unlike single party states, they actually allow multiple parties to compete. So other parties get legalized. Other opposition parties can exist within these systems. And so these countries, they allow these multiple parties to exist, but they're not permitted to win control. If it's a presidential system, they can't win control of the presidency, for example. Nor if it's a parliamentary system, can they win control of the prime minister position. So the head of the executive branch is always going to be from the ruling party. And furthermore, these opposition parties are only allowed to win a minority of seats in the legislature. And usually the dominant party will have what's called a supermajority. They'll have over 2/3 control. So there's no real competition for power, but an opposition can exist. And there are a mixture of formal and informal restrictions on this opposition. Some of these formal restrictions might be found in the Constitution, for example, and others might just be found within formal practices by the ruling regime itself. We'll get into how they control and manipulate elections in a second. So, let's take a look at the world's regime types, the different types of political systems that exist. Now, from the 1970s to the 2000s, approximately half the world became democracies. We call this the third wave of democratization. You see these countries in light blue on this map? They are all democracies in that they have competitive elections where it's possible for the opposition to actually win and kick out the incumbents. Now, the countries in red here are dictatorships, but there are differences between dictatorships. Now, the countries in dark red are what are called closed autocracies. These are countries that do not allow a real opposition to exist. So take China, for example. China is a single party dictatorship. They do not allow any other opposition parties to exist. Now, our countries in dark red in the Middle East, you see here the Arab Gulf countries, they're monarchies, right? So these monarchies, the power is vested within the monarchy itself. And of course, there are no elections to determine who the monarch is going to be or who the ruling family is going to be. Now, in contrast, these countries in light red are electoral autocracies, meaning they have elections, there are multiple parties, but only one party can win. So Russia under Vladimir Putin is an electoral autocracy. Putin and his party, United Russia, have dominated elections since 1999, but there are some opposition that's allowed to exist, even though there are very severe limits on their political activity. And as you can see, many of the democracies in the Middle East are electoral autocracies today, such as Egypt, Tunisia, Turkey, and so on and so forth. In fact, about 80% of the world's dictatorships today are electoral autocracies. So from the 1970s to the 2000s, we begin to see this type of system emerge within our Arab republics, not in our monarchies. And you're going to see why this is the case in a second. Those single party dictatorships dominated by Arab nationalists like Gamal Abdel Nasser, Bourguiba in Tunisia, and so on and so forth, they're going to transition to these types of systems. And one of the first and most important case examples of this is what happened to Egypt in the 1970s. Now, if you remember with this case study, from 1954 to 1970, we had a single party dictatorship led by Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was an Arab nationalist, a socialist, a single party state. The government got heavily involved in the economy. But after his death and after the decline in support for Arab nationalism after the 1967 defeat in the Six-Day War against Israel, Egypt is going to move away from this. And they're going to move towards, as we discussed last lecture, they're going to move towards capitalism. They're going to start to open up their economy to the West. They're going to engage in a structural adjustment program with the IMF, and they're going to open the economy, cut taxes, cut public spending. And on top of that, they are also going to shift towards the West by making political reforms. They're going to open up the system. So in 1976, Sadat starts the Infitah. Not only did he shift to capitalism, but he's going to shift towards democracy as well. And he eventually creates this new ruling party called the National Democratic Party. And notice the name change. Under Nasser, it was the Arab Socialist Party, but under Sadat, it's the National Democratic Party that emerges. Now, in the process, many political prisoners get released from prison. So while opening up this system, he releases from prison a lot of the liberals that were jailed by the Nasser regime, those who supported democracy. And he also releases from prison a lot of the Islamists from groups like the Muslim Brotherhood that supported Sharia law and traditional religious values. And for the first time since 1952, the Egyptian government allows political parties to form in the opposition. So, for example, in 1976, the Egyptian Arab Socialist Party is formed. So, a lot of left wingers were not happy with Sadat's economic reforms, shifting towards capitalism. They're going to join some of them this new party. Furthermore, those liberal activists released from prison, they're going to create the new WAF party. That was the old name of the liberal political party, the WAF party in Egypt, that was formed in 1919. If you remember from a previous lecture after World War I. So they're going to promote liberal capitalist values. And then, of course, the Muslim Brotherhood, they're going to get active after this. They get released from prison. And these Islamists, they start participating as independents. They didn't get legalized, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but they were able to participate as independents, as well as establish charity networks and other social movement activity. But despite this partial opening, the fact is that these parties were never actually allowed to win elections during this time period. The National Democratic Party won each and every election for the legislature and the presidency. So Sadat, who was president from 76 to 81, would continue to be in charge. And after his assassination, Hosni Mubarak, his successor, would be president for the next 3 decades. And so without any real competition in the system. And so we see this with other case studies in the region. So, for example, Tunisia from 1982 to 2011 is going to shift. Habib Bourguiba, who was that socialist leader who led a single party dictatorship since 1956. Well, he's going to start to open up things a little bit in 1982, and he's going to start to allow some opposition to exist. And after he was overthrown in a coup by the country's police in 87, his successor, Zain al-Abidine Ben Ali, he is going to create a new ruling party, okay, the Democratic Constitutional Rally. And on top of that, he is going to allow some opposition to exist. However, his party is going to dominate elections with, well over 90% of the vote in each and every election. And so he's going to severely limit what the opposition can and can't do. We see something happened very similar with Algeria. In 1989, the country's ruling party, the National Liberation Front, led by this long-serving dictator, President Chedli, he's going to open up the system as well, and he's going to start to allow opposition such as Islamist groups like the Islamic Salvation Front to participate in elections. And in Iraq, after the U.S. invaded the country and Saddam Hussein's kicked out, they're also going to shift to an electoral authoritarian system as well. And Yemen, after the country unified in 1991, they're going to create a new constitution, and then they're going to shift to an electoral authoritarian regime under Ali Abdul Saleh. So all of these countries are examples of Arab republics that shift towards this type of system that at least allows some opposition to exist. And I posted here an example, a primary document. This is an article from 2010, right before the 2011 revolution. I recommend reading it. It basically goes into how Egypt fixed the elections in that year. And while initially the Islamists and the liberals did initially participate in the first round of democratic elections for the legislature, the National Democratic Party, they're going to win over 80% of the vote in that first round. And then the opposition is going to boycott the second round of elections. And so this is an example they go into how the NDP fixed elections. And despite the electoral rigging, they'd often deny that, the elections were rigged, the ruling party. So how do elections get rigged in these systems? How do they get fixed? Well, it might not be in the ways that you necessarily think they get rigged. I think often Americans and other people living in democracies today, they often think of electoral rigging as ballot box stuffing, right? On the day of elections, somebody stuffs the ballot box with fraudulent votes or they counted wrong. Well, that certainly happens in authoritarian regimes. This is not the only way elections get rigged. It's not even the main way. So first things first, one of the things these regimes do is they will often ban opposition parties or severely limit their activity. Okay. And so in these systems, the way it works is if you're For example, you want to form an opposition party. You have to first get permission from the government. You have to apply often to the Minister of Interior. In these systems, these are the ministries that run the police. You have to get permission from the executive branch to do this, from the ruling president, right? And of course, what often happens is that applications often get rejected. They'll often use a variety of reasons to reject the applications. They might claim, for example, oh, your political party's Islamist, you can't really participate in democracy. Oh, your political party's representing an ethnic minority. Well, you're trying to weaken the national solidarity of the state. We can't let you run. Oh, your party consists of a bunch of radicals. We can't let you form a party. So they'll often use these trumped up reasons to prevent some of the opposition from running while allowing others to run. And oftentimes, they'll usually try to ban or limit the activity of some of the stronger opposition movements. Now, on top of that, even for the parties that do get legalized, they often have problems gaining access to the media. For one, some media outlets get banned or censored. So sometimes they just get outright shut down. Once again, you often have to go to a ministry of that handles media outlets to gain permission to form a television station, a newspaper, and so on and so forth. And if you don't get that permission, you can't legally operate. On top of that, even for the private media outlets that exist, they often feel a lot of pressure to censor. And if they see another media outlet getting cracked down upon, they might engage in self-censorship. And this could limit the ability of the opposition to influence discourse. And on top of that, these states also had state media outlets. Now, if you're, say, in Great Britain, you know what a state media outlet is, the BBC, right? In the United States, it's NPR. Well, in these countries, state media outlets lack independent editorial autonomy. And they prop up the ruling party. They promote the ruling party. They cover it favorably in the news. And in contrast, they will either not cover the opposition at all, or they will use these media outlets to denounce the opposition. And so this creates an uneven political discourse. Now, on top of that, for the opposition that's actually allowed to run, there are usually strict limits on their opposition campaigns. So, for example, when I was in Egypt back in 2010, one of the things I noticed is that while the ruling party, the NDP, could have their rallies and stadiums, and they could use public institutions to hold their campaigns, and of course they could use media outlets. The opposition would often be forced to hold a campaign rally in a back alley somewhere or a small restaurant somewhere where they could only hold a small crowd because they got restricted by the police on where they could do their campaigns. And on top of that, the ruling party gets to use the wealth and resources of the state, the government, to fund their campaigns. So there is an uneven spread of wealth between the opposition and the ruling party. And so this creates a disadvantage for these elections. Now, on top of that, oftentimes, the regime will also rely on just outright coercion if they feel the opposition is getting too strong. They might sometimes periodically arrest activists and throw them in jail for sometimes limited periods of time, sometimes for long periods of time, engaging in tactics like torture. So this is a way to kind of limit the activities of the opposition and scare them from behaving too aggressively. And finally, often in the weeks leading up to the election, the state will use its resources often to buy votes. Sometimes they'll go into, particularly in poor areas, because it's easier to buy the votes of individuals there. They'll go and drop off, bags of bread or bags of wheat on the doorsteps of peasants in villages, right, small towns, as a way to buy their vote. We call this clientelism, right? So this is when you buy the votes of individuals with state resources. And of course, the opposition doesn't have the ability to do this. So, this is all done before ballot box stuffing even is done on election day, right? So, in the months leading up to an election, the rigging has already taken place. And then finally on election day, we do often get ballot box stuffing. So, in Egypt, under Mubarak, it was often the case that after the ballots were, people voted, they put their votes in the ballot box. They would then take those boxes, the police would put them on trucks, take them back to the police station, and then engage in some ballot box stuffing right before they are then counted. And so here's an interesting question for you folks, or I should say a set of questions. Well, first, why does a dictatorship hold rigged elections? Well, there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, in a world that is becoming more democratic from the 70s to the 2000s, right? Third wave of democratization, these regimes wanted to increase their legitimacy with the Western world, right? The growing power of the United States and the European Union. And they also wanted to increase their legitimacy with some of their own population that was beginning to be influenced by growing democratic norms. So that's a part of the reason. Now, there's also other reasons as well that are surprising. Part of it as well, these systems, okay, they help to co-opt part of the opposition. So why do some of the opposition parties participate in what they know are rigged elections? Well, for one, some of them are hoping that by participating, that maybe one day they could have long-term effects on the system. Maybe they could influence the system from the inside, that they could influence other political elites and make some changes happen. And certainly by participating and having a minority voice in parliaments or, in a legislature, this could give them a bigger platform to speak their minds and maybe influence society. So that's part of it. Part of it as well is that there's benefits and perks to, being able to form your own political party and run for office. If you do win a seat, that comes with a nice salary, a nice cushy pension. There's a lot of benefits to that as well, personal benefits. Now, of course, though, some refuse to participate. And why is this the case? Well, obviously, these elections are rigged. Some idealists might find that by participating, you're giving legitimacy to a rigged system. They might decide to boycott instead. And on top of that, of course, some of the opposition faces more oppression than others. They have less of an ability to win seats than other opposition elements, and thus they might decide to boycott. And interestingly, what this does is it divides and conquers the opposition. It makes it so that the opposition is weaker. Some participate in the system, others don't. This could lead to internal conflict amongst those who are in the opposition here. All right. Now, why the shift to electoral authoritarianism, not only in the Middle East among the Arab republics, but in other parts of the world as well? Well, two major reasons for this shift, two big ones. Okay, of course, there are others, but these are two very important ones here. Number one, growing Western hegemonic domination. So during this era, we see the spread of democracy throughout the world as the Soviet Union declines and collapses, right? Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, their communist systems, their single party dictatorships decline and fall. By 1991, right, the Soviet Union is gone. And on top of that as well, we see this global shift towards capitalism and structural adjustment agreements. And, Western multinational companies are spreading throughout the globe. And the United States is becoming the world's dominant superpower. And if you needed a loan, if you needed to be able to get foreign aid, suddenly America and its allies become your only major option. Right. And this enables the United States and the EU to pressure developing countries more to make democratic reforms. And so thus, we begin to see throughout the world the global spread of democracy. So Latin America, some parts of sub-Saharan Africa, most of Eastern Europe, various parts of East and South Asia, they start to transition to democracy. But 50% of the world's countries become democracies. Now, even for the world's countries that remain dictatorships, they shifted to a form of dictatorship that was more liberal, that was less oppressive, that was a little more open. 80% of the dictatorships that exist today are electoral autocracies. Okay. Unlike North Korea or China, most dictatorships have elections where multiple political parties can participate. This is the case in Turkey, this is the case in Egypt, in Tunisia, and so on and so forth. So part of the reason for this shift had to do with these great global dynamics taking place. But there's also another reason. It had to do with the internal dynamics of these Arab republics. Remember, in the 50s and 60s, these countries had single party dictatorships that were socialist in nature. But by the 1970s and 80s, they began to open up their economies to capitalism because of their growing economic problems, the problems with debt, the failures of their socialist economic model in these countries. Uh, they had to, as a consequence, they started turning to the United States for access to loans. They started to turn to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And as a consequence of this, they were pressured then to cut public spending. Right, so they cut a lot of public spending on social welfare, on bread subsidies. They begin to cut government bureaucracies, and privatization took place. Well, as a consequence of this, the left begins to turn against these regimes, and there was growing domestic opposition. We talked last lecture about how there were food riots and bread riots, how there were union protests in the 70s and 80s in these Arab republics. And this partial liberalization as a consequence, ended up leading to not only an economic opening, but a political one. In order to co-opt this growing opposition, these states began to allow political parties to emerge in the opposition. So you're seeing more protests. So you promise those protesters, hey, we're going to make some reforms. Certainly, these regimes did use a lot of repression. Many of these protesters were thrown in prison. But these regimes realized if they wanted to survive in this era where democracy was spreading throughout the globe, they had to promise at least some reforms to get these protesters off the streets. And thus, we get this kind of partial liberalization. They allow some of the opposition to participate. And of course, by making these reforms, they strengthen ties with the West, right? So the West is seeing some movement towards liberalization. It makes it so that they're more likely as well to get loans and economic and military aid. And so, by the way, this is just the evidence here for the third wave of democratization. We could see here from the 1970s to the 2000s, huge spread of democracy across the developing world. And this was during the fall of communism. By the end of this era, about half of the world's countries become democratic. And of course, this was also a bigger part of a bigger trend of the spread of human rights norms, the spread of non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International and Minority Rights Group International promoting human rights abroad, and the spread of international governmental organizations like the United Nations, the European Union, also promoting democracy. And so we can see here on this chart here that INGOs and IGOs, right, their numbers grow from the 1970s to the 2000s in a very big way. And, of course, other pieces of evidence here, this was Egypt's bread riot in 1977, which was really one of the first really big anti-government protests that had taken place since 1952, those sets of protests that came also with a military coup led by the free officers. So lots of social instability during this era. Now, one of the things that's surprising about these regimes that formed in these Arab republics is how long they survived for. Now, they came out of a lot of instability that was taking place, economic and political instability in these Arab republics. And on top of it, there was a lot of pressure for democratization throughout the world. Yet, many electoral authoritarian regimes across the planet never fully democratized, or they had a lot of democratic backsliding. Now, why is this the case? It's interesting. These regimes might not transition to democracy, right? So it's an interesting question that a lot of political scientists have tried to figure out. Why did they get stuck in electoral authoritarianism? A very good work I recommend reading about this. My advisor at the University of Alabama, back when I got my PhD, Holger Elbrecht, he wrote this article with another scholar called Waiting for Godot about how democracy never really arrived in these places. And what's interesting is that there was this expectation amongst political science scholars and international community that eventually these countries would transition to democracy, that these electoral reforms were the first of many, that Sadat's regime, that the Bourguiba regime, and so on and so forth, they would eventually transition. But this never happened. Now, this term waiting for Godot, by the way, it's based on this play about these two guys who sit around talking, waiting for this guy Godot to arrive, but he never arrives. There's this anticipation that never takes place. And so these Middle Eastern regimes, surprising durability, right? And so why is this the case? Well, I'm going to give you three major potential reasons why electoral authoritarianism has survived for so long, not only amongst the Arab republics, but also maybe in some other dictatorships across the world. Well, first off, number one, part of the problem is that Western countries, while they sometimes promoted democracy during this era, also had other interests, security interests, interests dealing with economics, terrorism, oil, and sometimes the West acted with hypocrisy, sometimes supporting a dictatorship because of some other variety of reasons. And this was particularly true within the Middle East. Oftentimes, the United States and the EU have been hesitant to pressure Arab republics and other governments in the region to too strongly liberalize. Now, you might ask, why is this the case? Well, first off, many Arab states are very strategically important. Okay, they have a lot of things about them that are important to the West. So, for example, about half of the world's oil resources are located in the Arab or the Persian Gulf, right? So that region of the world where we've got Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, these countries have a lot of oil resources. Furthermore, those oil resources are transported via pipelines through other regimes, through Jordan into, Israel, into Syria. Some of that oil as well is taken via boat through the Gulf into the Indian Ocean, into the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal, and what is Egypt, to the Mediterranean, and then to Europe. And so oil, very important resource, okay, for the world's economy, right? It fuels much of the world's economy. And the US is very concerned with it. Now, you might, as a scholar, argue, oh, this importance of oil has been over exaggerated. But hear me out here. Number one, the United States has a large concentration of its military forces in the Arab Gulf today. Number two, Arab regimes are some of the world's largest receivers of economic aid from the United States. In fact, all of the top ones are. Israel receives $4 billion. Egypt receives $2 billion a year. And we've got all those military bases in the Arab Gulf protecting those monarchies from their enemies. And so thus the United States is a bit worried that if you promote democratic reforms, this might lead to instability or even someone getting elected that is anti-Western and doesn't want Western influence in these countries. So there was some fear of instability and thus some pushback to the idea that we should pressure these countries too much to open up. And part of this as well is driven by a mix of xenophobia as well as perhaps, genuine concerns about Islamist victories. So, of course, there are some anti-Islamist sentiments in the West, some anti-Muslim sentiments, according to polling. Of course, not all Americans are Islamophobic, but some are, right? And on top of that as well, there is, fears in the past that were created by what happened with 9/11 and what happened with terrorism. And so this has created a lot of fear of this idea that Islamists could get elected if you have free and fair elections in these Arab republics. And so, as a consequence, oftentimes there's been hesitancy to promote democracy. And of course, after 9/11, and you're going to see this in a future lecture, the United States began to really prioritize terrorism over other issues such as democratization in the region. And so as a consequence, we gave a lot of support to dictatorships across the region in the form of foreign aid. And on top of that as well, these electoral authoritarian regimes often use the potential threat of Islamists, terrorism, or an Islamist electoral victory as a justification for cracking down on the opposition. You crack down on a protest, you throw people in jail, you go, oh, it's not because I don't like democracy, it's because I'm cracking down on these Islamists who don't like democracy, right? So it's used as a kind of excuse to the West to justify a crackdown on democracy. And so one of our Arab republics here, Egypt, is the second largest receiver of US aid on the planet, over $2 billion a year. So this is an example here, right, of how foreign aid by the United States is given to an electoral autocracy in the region. And the U.S. justification for this aid, particularly a little over half goes to the Egyptian military, is to create stability within Egypt. Now, there's also a second reason why these regimes have had durability, because these regimes have different types of mechanisms for maintaining control. Now, the single party socialist states in the Arab world, as well as the communist states and the communist bloc, part of how they maintained control was they used ruthless oppression to root out the opposition, but they also had a large populist base of support. They provided universal employment, big welfare states. Now, in contrast, electoral authoritarian regimes, they don't have a large base of support. Remember, these regimes kept public spending. They have a small base of support. So instead, the way they rule is by dividing and conquering the opposition. And electoral authoritarianism gives them a way to do this. See, in these regimes, some opposition ended up participating in the rigged elections, hoping to influence the system from the inside. And what this enabled the regime to do is that it actually allowed them to monitor the opposition better. If you're allowing some of the opposition to form parties and participate in politics, well, those parties have headquarters, they have leadership, and the autocracy, they can monitor those individuals, and they could co-opt some of them into the regime. Okay, perhaps by making some compromises with them. So, for example, during the 70s and 80s, the Sadat regime, while they didn't allow the Muslim Brotherhood to win elections, they did allow them to proselytize in mosques, establish some charity networks, and run some hospitals and businesses. They allowed them to engage in some activity. So they compromised with them. And so this enables the regime to better identify opposition and co-opt some of them. Now, some of the opposition, in contrast, boycotts elections or chooses exile or gets suppressed politically with violence. And thus, what this ends up doing is it ends up dividing and weakening the opposition. And what these regimes will often do is they will choose some elements of society to support and others to constrict and to repress with violence. And what this does is it turns the opposition against one another, and it makes it easier for the electoral authoritarian regime to stay in control. Remember, if the opposition is divided, they can't unite against a dictatorship. We call this divide and conquer. This is actually much like what the autocracies, the British and French, did with colonialism, right? So the Arab republics engaged in a lot of divide and conquer here. Now, sometimes this meant pitting liberals against Islamists, and it's often the case that they would play these groups against each other as a way to get them to hate each other instead of focusing on the regime itself. Sometimes as well, they would pit ethnic majorities against minorities, supporting one over the other in various cases. So Sunnis versus Shia, Kurds versus Arabs, and so on and so forth. Get these groups pitted against each other. And so, for example, sometimes these autocrats would get liberals or Christian minorities to support the regime out of fear that, hey, if we actually allowed real democracy, those Islamists would come into power. So if you don't support us, if you have real democracy, those Islamists will win. And this gets a lot of liberals and, ethnic minorities, religious minorities to then support the autocratic state, even though they themselves might believe in democracy. And so here, just to give an example of this, Egypt, 10% of its country is Christian. And one of the things that you might be surprised to learn is that during the period of Sadat and Mubarak's regime, the Coptic Church pretty much supported the country's electoral authoritarian regime. Now, of course, sometimes there were tensions and conflict, but at the end of the day, the church supported Mubarak. Why? Part of the reason is fear that Islamists like the Muslim Brotherhood would come to power. In fact, a lot of Christians, not all, but many, did support the Mubarak regime for that reason. Now, there's one other big factor that has kept these regimes in power for a long time, something called the exit option. Now, in dictatorships, okay, authoritarian regimes specifically, okay, people really have three options politically if you want to get politically active, right? So, three things you can do. Number one, you can voice your loyalty. And these electoral authoritarian regimes, they did have some loyalists, right? Members of the police and military, which received a lot of funding in countries like Egypt and Algeria, heavily support the regime, as do the crony class of businessmen that merged in the late 70s, the 80s, okay, in places like Egypt and in Tunisia, right? So they had some loyalists. Of course, they also had some people who voiced their opposition and tried to participate in elections or boycott those elections. So groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and the New Wafd Party in Egypt are great examples of this. Groups like Ennahda in Tunisia, good example of this. The Islamic Salvation Front in Algeria, another great example here. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, and so on and so forth. And finally, some of these groups, some people had what's called the exit option, meaning they could, instead of participating domestically in politics, they could find ways around the system and engage in what is called exits. Sometimes exit is literal, meaning leaving the country. From the 1970s to the 2000s, okay, exit options grew for people living in the Arab world and within these Arab republics specifically. Okay, now sometimes exiting a political system, say you're unhappy with the system, you don't like the way things are running, you can actually leave the country. So because of globalization, because of increased access to air travel and other transport options, because of growing free trade agreements, and because of growing access to educational institutions abroad, many more people began traveling and going to other countries. Okay, and this gave a lot of people in developing countries a kind of way to exit electoral authoritarian regimes if they didn't like the way things are going. So if they were happy with growing rates of economic inequality, they felt there weren't opportunities for economic prosperity, you move abroad. If you feel like, hey, the quality of my public institutions like education are declining because the state is cutting funding, I could go abroad to the West to get a university education. Or, hey, the government is cracking down on my opposition movement. I can maybe go abroad into exile and go to a democracy that will respect my rights to speak out freely, right? So a lot of people ended up going to the West for these reasons, to the European Union, to the United States and Canada, as well as other countries like Australia, for example. Now, others as well also went to the Arab Gulf. And for maybe a lot of Islamists who are less comfortable with going to the West, many ended up going to Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, the United Arab Emirates, in order to go for work opportunities. Remember, after that 1973 oil spike, after the 1973 war, oil prices grew. These Arab Gulf states grew very wealthy, and they began importing guest workers. Many of these guest workers came from these Arab republics. And once you go abroad, what you then do is you send money back home. So you go, you work, you send remittances back home to families. And now what this does, it does a couple of things that are bad for sustaining authoritarianism. I say good for sustaining authoritarianism, but bad if you value democratization, right? So for one, by sending money back home, citizens back home don't have to find good jobs within their countries, right? They can be satisfied even though the domestic economy isn't providing for them. That eases some of the pressure on domestic regimes to create real economic growth for people. Number two, it often leads to some of the best and brightest leaving these countries. Steve Jobs, his father, came from Syria. It's the founder of Apple, right? Steve Jobs. So a lot of people, okay, who had ambition, who were well educated, they decide to leave this region and go abroad for better opportunities. We call this a brain drain. Once again, this is not good for democratization, right? Because you're losing some of your most ambitious people. Now, on top of that as well, as the state began to cut public spending, citizens began to find other exit options at home. They found ways that they could ignore the state. by establishing their own private services. So they could ignore how bad the state is doing by creating their own private communities. Some of the middle class during this era, in fact, some of the middle class were actually with the remittance money that they were receiving from their relatives abroad. They started to then do things like build private schools, not run by the government, but by private schools, often staffed in part by either foreigners abroad or maybe some Arabs who went abroad to, get their education and came back home. So they start to establish private schools with Western, British, and American curriculums, French curriculums. In fact, I taught at a private school for Egyptians that had an American-based curriculum when I was in Egypt. They begin to establish private hospitals to provide better health care than the really awful public hospitals in places like Egypt. And they start to create gated communities. In fact, in Egypt, okay, 30 desert cities were built on the outskirts of Cairo from the 1970s to the 2000s. And so, the middle class, they begin to invest in these, these gated community projects, right? And they begin to move to the outskirts of Cairo, escaping all the growing problems of Cairo with overpopulation, pollution, poorly run public institutions. This is an exit option. Now, even for the poor, there were exit options, not only the option of, maybe trying to go abroad, but also because of the fact that the state began to loosen control, many private charity networks begin to enter countries like Egypt and Tunisia with funding from the Arab Gulf, countries like Saudi Arabia. They begin through soft power to influence these countries. And thus we begin to see a lot of charity networks led by Islamists. Okay. And so thus, if you're struggling, you could turn to your local mosque. You could turn to your local private charity network for supports. And so we see these Islamist social networks emerge. And of course, religion as well is kind of a form of escape, is it not, right? You're suffering, things are not going so well. An exit, right? You exit this world, right, by thinking about the next one, right? So that's kind of an exit option here. And finally, the black market starts to grow greatly during this era. If the state isn't building good public housing anymore, good neighborhoods, well, you build your own informal neighborhood, your own informal housing. And many Egyptians did this in Cairo, right? A lot of informal communities begin to emerge during this era. In fact, about 2/3 of Cairo consist of informal communities, right? With, buildings that were not officially approved by the government, neighborhoods that were not officially approved by the government. We begin to see a lot of tax evasion, right? So exit option, stop paying your taxes, move to these informal communities, ignore the states. And, because the state couldn't provide public housing anymore or resources to these communities, they kind of had to ignore the buildup of these informal communities. And because they were, getting a lot of their funding from remittances abroad, the state, really starting to let go of control over development. And on top of that as well, another form of escape has to do with the black market, narcotics and drugs. So, we begin to see an increase in drug use in different parts of the world during this era. And so in places like Egypt, Morocco, smoking hash, for example. We also begin to see a lot of human trafficking. While some people were able to travel abroad legally, some did so illegally to the European Union across rickety boats across the Mediterranean Ocean. And many human traffickers made a profit taking advantage of these desperate people. So we see all these different exit options emerge, but what they do is they relieve pressure from these electoral authoritarian regimes to make further reforms. And this, by the way, is an example of the growth of these exit options. You can see here before 1970, there were relatively few Middle East immigrants in the United States. But by the time we get to 2010 approximately, there were well over 2 million living in the United States. And we begin to see remittances play a great part in the economies of these Arab republics, as well as many other states in the region. Lebanon, which suffered from this horrible civil war, it had a lot of people that went abroad, and now by the time we get to 2010, approximately 30% of its economy was dependent on remittances. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip over 20%, depending on remittances. Yemen, over 20%. Egypt, so, a little less than 10%, for example, in 2010. So we see over time, remittances become more and more important for many of these countries. Now, one last thing about these dictatorships. While they have their strengths in terms of their durability, they, of course, have their problems. Number one, unlike the Arab nationalist single party dictatorships under Gamal Abdel Nasser, they lacked legitimacy, these electoral authoritarian regimes, right? For one, they were making strong ties with the West and even states like Israel, which was not popular with the mass publics. They were cutting social welfare spending, which was not popular with the mass publics. And even the way they engaged in capitalism wasn't popular with some of the liberal idealists because of the amount of cronyism and corruption within the system and the fact that they weren't really moving towards democracy. So they lacked a real mass base of support in terms of having ideological legitimacy. Their base of support was very narrow, confined to these military elites and these crony capitalists. And so thus there was a lot of opposition to these regimes. In fact, they allowed some of this opposition to exist. And of course, the way they controlled that opposition was divide and conquer. The fact is that it does create, because that opposition does exist, it creates a bigger potential for rebellion and civil war. Unlike the single party era, this era had a lot more protests that took place. And of course, eventually the big protest moment is going to happen from 2010 to 2011 with the Arab Spring. We have an entire unit dedicated to this. So I'll talk about those mass protests later. So by allowing an opposition to exist, eventually there's going to come a point where those liberals and Islamists are going to start to work together to turn their anger at the ruling regime. Now, on top of that as well, sometimes what could happen is that these regimes can miscalculate, and sometimes they don't rig the elections enough, either before the elections or on election day, and mistakes can get made. Sometimes the opposition could win a lot more than they expected. In a few cases, we've seen in electoral authoritarian regimes, they actually might even win. Now, the one big case of this happening in the Middle East was Algeria. In 1989, when their regime opened up to elections, they tried to rig those elections, but they didn't rig them enough. And what ended up happening is the ruling National Liberation Front of Arab Nationalist Party, they lost to the Islamist Islamic Salvation Front. So the secularist party loses to Islamists. What happened is eventually the military decided to negate the elections, overthrow that democratically elected government, and this led then to an 8-year civil war between Islamists and the FLN. Eventually the FLN won, but it came with 8 years of civil war, and they would continue with electoral authoritarianism in the aftermath of that civil war. But this is an example here of sometimes the rigging of elections could go wrong. And so what can also happen, by the way, with these regimes is that over time, the opposition can become harder to co-opt. So the beginning of an electoral authoritarian regime's lifespan, making a few reforms can make a lot of people happy. But over time, if you don't actually transition to a democracy eventually, this could lead to frustration and opposition building up within the system. And this frustration could lead to larger protest movements and lots of other problems. Okay. And of course, there's tons of problems as well that come with crony capitalism, the failures of economic growth for the vast majority of people. So while GDP did grow, it only grew for a small number of individuals within these countries. And so what happens within these electoral authoritarian regimes is we do see an increase in police repression over time. And so, thus, that's kind of how Hosni Mubarak's regime worked. It had these variety of mechanisms to divide and conquer the opposition, but it was a narrow regime with support from the military and a small group of crony capitalists that had a lot of opposition under it. And eventually he was overthrown in a revolution in 2011. And by the way, Hosni Mubarak, unlike people like Gamal Abdel Nasser, he was not a charismatic figure. He didn't have this grand ideology to promote to the masses. He was a boring public speaker. He often, in fact, avoided the public. So, very different type of regime from that single party state under Nasser. Okay, so that does it for today's lecture. I hope you got something out of it. Leave questions below if you, have any thoughts or something that you want to talk about, and I'll make sure to respond to it. Have a good